Well, for more on where the two sides can go from here, let's bring in Perry Wong, Managing Director of Research at the Milken Institute. Welcome.
Nice to be here.
So let's start with an overall look. What's been the economic fallout so far of the trade tensions?
Well, so far we don't have any tangible fallout in terms of impacting individual workers or trade flows, not at the moment. But however, I want to make a comment on, I think the tension itself creates uncertainty. And as you might have heard, that the producers of various commodity might start to look for another buyers. And that itself is not a pleasant practice from anyone who is engaging international trade.
And so, talking about this uncertainty, what is that doing to these, when you look at these proposed tariffs on top of it, the additional ones that may be coming up, how is that weighing on companies, not just in China, but the US as well?
I think it's the damage is on both sides, and that's why economists always say when you engage in trade war against each other, the bigger loser, is actually are the consumer and the companies too, on both ends, both countries. So it's not something that the countries should take it very lightly. And the damage actually would take a while to repair.
Now, we've seen that there's been quite the roller coaster in trade tensions since Vice Premier Liu He's last visit to the US. So what are the expectations for this visit?
I think that much we can, expect from the visit to identify the gaps where the biggest disagreements are, and I think establish a timetable to, if you will, iron the wrinkle out of the system so that the trade deficit can be played down further over time. I think that would be something that both sides need to accomplish, and accomplish very shortly.
So as we look at the differences, where do you see the biggest divides right now from the negotiating standpoints?
I think judging by both sides shooting over the bow on warnings, that would be China's IP protections, trade practice, and also I think from the Chinese government's perspective, the U.S. government's targeted list of industries on China, it happened to be the same list that the Chinese government would like to promote as an engine for the economic growth for the next generation to come. So that actually would be rather sticky for the two governments to iron that out.
And you're referring there to the China Made in China 2025 plan. So let's also look at how this visit will perhaps differ from their last encounter. How do you think there might be any differences?
I think if the first visit by the U.S. delegation to Beijing is about a week and a half or 2 weeks ago, this round, I think they know that much, how big the gaps are and what's workable, what has to be solved or addressed later. So I think by that measure, I would expect we would hear some good news, at least a timeline that the two nations, how they can play down the tension and find a solution, at least a workable solution. I think that will be something good for both countries.
And what do you see as the likely areas that the two sides could possibly reach some agreement on?
I think first to come, I think the Chinese government, more likely than not, to offer on the table would be the further opening of the financial sectors. Now, we have heard stories that you have companies from Great Britain, company from Japan, and the later add to the list will be American Bank, now owning license to do security trading in China, either wholly owned or majority owned operations. So I think the Chinese government can allow that to open wider. And second, I think in terms of the ownership, say auto parts, auto productions, perhaps the Chinese government, just based on the principle of President Xi's comment or statement from the Boao Forum, that those sectors can be opened up further. And that would be somewhat a sweetener to the talk, I believe.
And speaking of high-tech, you've got to, of course, talk about ZTE. We saw President Trump tweet this week about finding ways with President Xi to save the Chinese telecoms giant. So why the change of heart on ZTE, and what are the broader implications for trade talks overall with this move?
I don't know. It's hard to say. But I do see, if I follow the economic logic, that's very simple. CTE is one of the largest telecom or cell phone equipment makers in China, in Asia. So they do buy a lot of parts. The majority, the most expensive parts of their products is from the US, from a few companies. So by putting that company out of business, American firm will lose their business as well. So it's not the incentive, I think, for both sides to put a company out of operation, harming each other equally, or perhaps about the same.
All right, thank you for your insights, Perry Wong, Managing Director of Research at the Milken Institute.